Okay. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Josie, 516 Arts, the University of New Mexico, for having me here tonight. It is really like coming home when I come to New Mexico. My family's lived here for 11 generations, hailing from Chimayo, and also right on the border between Colorado and New Mexico in a little village called La Florida that's just on the other side of the New Mexican border in Colorado in the Valle de San Luis. And I'm going to talk about two strands of work which may seem disconnected, but they're actually born of the same mother, and they're born here in this region. I'm going to talk about being a border citizen, and I'm going to talk about 3D printing. They seem like they have nothing to do with each other, but I'll try to tell that story, and if I forget, it doesn't matter. So sit back and relax, because this might go on for a while. I mentioned I'm from the San Luis Valley, which is right there and straddles the border between the United States and Mexico. But as a border citizen, we were the northernmost frontier of the border. And we still live within those consequences of the political shifts that took place during that time. And so it's important that the political transformations that are occurring at the contemporary border will have radical consequences in the future. We are the legacy of that. Of course, this is the upper reaches of the Rio Grande Watershed, which becomes also known as the Rio Bravo, which defines the border between the United States and Mexico today. But in 1845, this was what was left of the Mexican territory as Texas seceded the Union, thereby splitting the San Luis Valley in half, with one side being Mexico and the other side being an uncontested and undefined area more related to Texas, at least territorially. And during this time, there's an enormous amount of militarization that is taking place at this region. At the same time, I should say that there is a migration north through Spanish and Mexican land grants that are attempting to define this zone. And this is one reason why people live at these fringes of this border, which is a very difficult place to live if you've ever been to San Luis Valley in the winter of 30 below zero. But the forts are very interesting to me because they represent the kind of hybridity of culture that exists in this frontier. These are American forts constructed of adobe. They still exist there today, and there's a number of them. Fort Garland, maybe you've visited them, but they're architectural monuments, really architectural masterpieces in some ways for being part of this collision, coming from a legacy of architecture that's been in place since the 1100s, firming itself up in military outposts along this border in a place where Native Americans, Mexicanos, and Anglos are coming together. And it's this collision of cultures, of food, of language that is interesting to me in the realm and context of architecture, because it's the collisions that create frictions. They create problems, they create interesting questions, and they create beautiful things, and they create horror. In 1937, the state of Colorado declared martial law and decided that no New Mexicans with a Mexican ancestry could enter the state of Colorado. And they set up border patrol stations at the border between New Mexico and Mexico, sending back American citizens of Spanish and Mexican descent back into their home country, into their home state. Of course, very difficult for borderland residents of the border between Colorado and New Mexico. I have many friends. In fact, my high school superintendent went to sleep in New Mexico and you went to the bathroom in Colorado because his house straddled the border. And we see how that hybridity is transformative of the architecture. San Lorenzo in the 1800s, entirely built out of mud by hand, wood felled from the hills behind to make the vigas on an earthen roof. Fast forward into the 30s, you see the advent of the railroad has transformed. There's milled lumber in place, corrugated metal roofs. You know this history very well. And what happens today when we reference back to the history of what these things should be? Where do we freeze a culture in flux and border in flux in time architecturally? In this case, it's plastered with earth, but also with a cementatious plaster. The roof has been removed. Why is that the right history? What is the wrong history? It has a tar roof now, not an earth roof, but there's still a ladder so you can go up the stairs and check the tar. And it has this strange little portico in front that's just jutting out, which I don't know what period that came from. And I practice this in my own practice, thinking about being a hybrid citizen, a borderland citizen, and how do you make architecture of the border? For example, this house that we designed in Marfa, Texas, that weaves together traditions of earthen building, using earthen plasters on the exterior and the interior, using mud bricks from New Mexico and from Ojinaga, Mexico, to build a house in Marfa, Texas, weaving concrete that is a structural solution, but also represents a kind of cultural solution about keeping the infrastructure and plumbing and electricity apart from the earth, apart from the concrete and the structure. And other projects that we've worked on, like Prada Marfa, which walks the line between rich and poor, between Anglo and Mexican, the United States and Mexico, and explores those boundaries and those dualities, but at the same time attempts to blur them, or at least bring those issues into the open in the construction of this store called Prada Marfa, which sits outside of Marfa, out in the Chihuahuan desert along a desolate road, which is not a store, it's a commentary. Contains a 2004 line of purses and shoes. You can't go in. And it has become a cultural object and quite popular, but also there's a horror implicit in that store, which in its irony, in its problematics, in its polemic, the fact that during the construction we would see people walking for miles in the desert and suddenly a helicopter would descend on them to pick them up and carry them away after they've worn out their shoes. The building is made out of adobe, cast in a cementatious mortar, just like the United States military did in the construction of their forts to protect against that US-Mexico border. So that if this is ever discovered as an archaeological artifact in the future, one would have to decipher what was happening at this moment in time that produced this strange building. And again, it has become a cultural object, kind of an icon that shifts between architecture and art and its meaning and pop culture. That's Beyonce, if not everyone recognizes that person. But I see that along the contemporary US-Mexico border, there is the potential to explore these kinds of transformations that are taking place right now, not only in terms of the militarization of that border, but the problems associated with constructing a military structure along that border as it affects the lives of people and the environment, and the 14 plus sister cities that share that border. And this is the topic of the book that contains the work that's both at 516 Arts and the Albuquerque Museum, and some of it is in the gallery here today. And really the book is a rumination on this topic beginning in 2008 till I wrote it a week before the election that put Donald Trump into our presidency today. So this is not a book or a rumination about the border wall as it's discussed currently. This is an attempt to understand the border as it exists. And currently there are 690 miles of border wall in place. And so during his campaign, when he would stand in front of audiences and say, "I'm going to build a wall," and everybody's like, "Yay!" as if someone had finally come to build the wall, it kind of revealed to me an ignorance that exists that doesn't understand that a wall is in place and there's enormous amounts of problems associated with it, and why would we perpetuate those problems, especially when they come at a cost of $4 million per mile in taxpayer money, constructed of steel and concrete, Vietnam and Persian Gulf era landing mats. There are high-tech borders that are enormously expensive, high-tech border walls made out of Wi-Fi, surveillance system, sensors, aerostat blimps, infrared, that patrol this border. This is one of the most expensive, called the floating fence, that sits atop the Algodones dunes, called floating fence, but actually it's a sinking fence that machines have to pick up every now and then and place back onto the dunes as it sinks. $3.4 billion have been spent constructing this wall since the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And $49 billion will be needed to construct and maintain this wall over the course of the next 25 years. Again, this is the wall that's already in place. This has been approved. This has been legislated and moving forward, and has moved forward through the Bush presidency, through the Obama presidency, and continues today. So let's put that into an architectural context. What can $49 billion also buy? It could buy 300 Seattle public libraries, 204 Disney concert halls, or 500 miles of the High Line. Remember, I told you there are 690 miles constructed of wall today. So imagine that kind of investment put into place along the US-Mexico border today. Now, I frame this in the context of architecture because the wall is something that is in fact designed and shapes the spaces around it. And it is designed in part with Sandia National Laboratories and Texas A&M University at a place called Fence Lab. And the way they test the fence for its impermeability is they take vehicles and they load them up with 40,000 pounds and they ram it into the wall at 50 miles an hour to demonstrate how these structures cannot be overcome. But in Mexico, there's research that's taking place as well. These are portable bridges that you can drive up to the wall, and they unfold in some cases, and trucks can just drive right over the wall. And sometimes it's very successful, and sometimes it's not. So in this case, it's been high-centered, but you can see the ambition of driving over a 16-foot wall, just laying out a few ladders. It also comes at a cost of human lives. And since 1994, nearly 6,000 people have died trying to cross the border. The wall is often constructed in urban environments, and it pushes people to further extremes in the desert, and dehydration is one of the principal causes of death of people trying to cross the border. And over 30 laws were waived for the construction of the wall. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 became the highest law in the land, overriding Native American protection rights, environmental protection rights, Wilderness Act. Nothing can stand in the way of the construction of the wall that was approved in 2006. And interestingly enough, the wall is not constructed always on the political border. In fact, it has to be constructed on American soil. And because the difficulty of, especially in the landscape that is adjacent to the meandering river, it's sometimes constructed up to 3 miles inland, leaving behind an enormous amount of territory, up to 40,000 acres behind that wall, that's comprised of private property, farms, wildlife, refuges, Native American lands. In this case, the wall had been designed by the Army Corps of Engineers to cut through the University of Brownsville at Texas campus. And after much negotiation, because the students would have to show their passport to go from class to class and be given a code, they decided to reinforce the fence that defined this golf course owned by the university, which has since gone bankrupt. But zooming in, the wall has done something interesting to me, which is bring people together. It's been a catalyst to react against and has shaped space in a number of ways, including in an activist way, that there are things like these binational yoga classes that take place. I call this move the monument because there are nearly 300 of these monuments that are maintained both by the United States and Mexico along the US border from California to El Paso, Texas. And I too have created a series of monuments in a way, but I call them recuerdos. I call them souvenirs. I use this term because I want us to remember the moment that we constructed this wall, that we approved this wall, and the conditions and events that have occurred because of the construction of this wall. And they come in the form of snow globes, they come in the form of board games, ant farms, maps, postcards, keychains. And so I'm going to talk to you about the stories that led to the making of these objects. Stories like this well-documented photograph where a Border Patrol agent bought a frozen treat through the wall from a vendor. And what does that mean? Does that constitute illegal trade? The money was slipped through the wall, the paleta was slipped through the wall by a border patrol agent, no less. And so this leads to these stories that I attempt to solidify within these souvenirs. In this case, I've always called this the burrito wall, where seats and benches and food carts could be built in the wall to demonstrate a way that we might begin to engage this wall or attack it or address it or dematerialize it or give it some meaning that would begin to dismantle it. Thinking, and really they're ruminations, they're hyperboles, they're stories, they're not so much designs as they are reactions. In this case, if the wall is an impediment to north-south pedestrian traffic, why can't it serve as an armature for east-west pedestrian traffic in the form of bicycle paths and walking paths? Why can't it serve as a binational library where the wall itself is reduced to a bookshelf where knowledge can be shared and ideas could be exchanged? Why can't we engage it in a way that brings musicians and performers and audiences to the wall to begin to question what that wall really is and to talk about the problems of the wall and to question ideas of who's the audience and who's the spectacle? This particular drawing is called Swing Wall, and people on both sides sit inside the swing, and there's no way really out, but you swing across to the other country for just a moment and then you're sent back. Or the teeter-totter, which really speaks to the relationships and synergies that we have with our neighbor to the south, with the understanding that what we do on one side is going to have consequences on the other side. The New River, which is the most polluted river in the United States, is an interesting story because, in fact, the moment that this river enters into the United States from Mexico, the wall opens up for it, as if to say, welcome, bring your E. coli and your fecal chloroform, bring the diseases that are associated with it, and invite people to jump in this river and cross with that. And harm their health. And then the wall begins on both sides as if one is more dangerous than the other. What if instead we took those same budgets used to construct these walls and we actually constructed wastewater treatment plants to handle the effluents from the New River? So really this isn't two landscapes. I like to think about this as a landscape that has been divided, and what we have to do is begin to think about how to bring these landscapes together, to suture them, to stitch them. On one side of the landscape, however, things have changed. For example, this might be the backyard of someone along the border, their lawn's being mowed, there's the mailbox, and on the other side, someone has used the wall, in fact, for the fourth wall of their house. I reflected on this through the creation of these series of blueprints. Blueprints that take on the idea of the wall being a wall within a house. And you can see on one side the typical size of a house in San Diego, California, and the other side the typical size of a house constructed in Tijuana. You can see the thicknesses of the walls are different between balloon frame construction and concrete block construction. You can see the sizes of the rooms, but you can also see that in this case the kitchen table is divided in half, or the living room is divided in half, or the bedroom is divided in half, because the wall not only divides geographies, it also divides families. And the book has a very simple ethos. A quote by the architect Hassan Fathi, which says, architects in fact do not design walls but the spaces between them. And I think that's the most important thing to understand, especially in the desires that have taken place in the last several months that are called for architects to consider this wall, to design the wall. I endorse any form of activism that moves forward. I think it's important to recognize that we must smuggle design into the landscapes that are affected by this existing wall. And so some of the stories that exist in the book, in the chapter Recuerdos, I'm going to go through them very quickly because I want to tell you some of the stories. Like Stonewall. which is a story about the throwing of rocks from one side to another. In Mexico, rocks are often thrown towards Border Patrol agents as a distraction tactic or in retaliation to something that has happened. And this has caused damage to Border Patrol vehicles. Here's an example of that. But there has been a retaliation against that. And 54 people have actually died on Mexican soil being shot by Border Patrol agents from the United States through the wall. Yet no Border Patrol agent has ever died as a consequence of a rock throwing. But there have been consequences, such as the downing of 2 helicopters patrolling over areas both in California and Arizona by rocks. And one response by Border Patrol agents speaks to the next chapter, which I call Field of Dreams. Border Patrol agents have been erecting baseball backstops along the US-Mexico border wall to protect themselves and their vehicles from rock attacks. And even more recently, they have instituted backstops as part of the design of border walls where they can stop and park their vehicles. But never had it been considered that perhaps there can be a relationship between border backstops and Border Patrol when children or communities from the other side could simply come across and in fact play baseball. And it asks questions about what it means to hit a home run in this scenario. Maybe the Border Patrol agent would just throw the ball to the other side. In speaking about projectiles, there are many other things besides rocks and maybe baseballs that are thrown across the wall. And the wall, in my opinion, is a medieval structure. It's a medieval reaction to a contemporary issue. And in response to a medieval architecture are medieval military devices like trebuchets and cannons, which were used in medieval times to dismantle and surmount walls. And so many trebuchets have been discovered along the US-Mexico border that catapult bales of marijuana in the United States that weigh up to 40 pounds. Or high-powered cannons that use the motor of the engine to make compressed air to launch bales of drugs across the border. And there's often been a question, have humans as well ever been launched across the border? In fact, many people blamed me for that the teeter-totter was in fact a kind of catapult to launch people across the wall. So I don't know if you know the show Mythbusters, but Mythbusters once set out to ask the question, have humans ever been launched, could it be possible if humans could be launched across the wall? And so they made this enormous catapult and made a 200-pound dummy. And they launched the human about 200 yards to see if it was in fact possible. And he's like, yes, it can be done. But they admitted maybe this wouldn't be safe. However, the gentleman who holds the record for the longest for being the human cannonball with the longest distance is in fact also the first person to ever be documented to be launched across the US-Mexico border. Passport in hand, he was given permission by the US Border Patrol agents to be launched from Tijuana, Mexico, into the United States, landing in this net. I don't know if we have sound. Do we have sound? Yeah. Can you hear that?
Yeah, I carried it everything.
How was the jump?
Good. This is
Was it what you expected?
Yeah, it's easy. It's all right.
By this time, did you find out what was going on? Why did you jump?
For money. I get paid.
I suppose all you heard that. There's a little bit of a New Mexican accent right there. For money. The next story is called Wall y Ball. Volleyball has been another form of activism that has taken place along the border. Again, calling questions of illegal trade and performance, bringing people together on the beach, negotiating a line in the sand, and really recognizing the relationship between bodies across space. And it has been played for a number of decades along the US-Mexico border, but even longer in the region. And maybe you're familiar with this traditional game of ulama that originated in Mexico. And it's really a form of volleyball in some ways, where players on both sides are negotiating a line in the sand. It's kind of a netless or wall-less volleyball. But it's the oldest game that's continuously played, also with a rubber ball, but a very heavy ball that they must bounce across using only their hips, and it continues to be played today. But it's a dangerous game, and people have actually died playing this game, and they leave with bruises and sometimes broken bones. And so I always think it's interesting, this relationship between this game that was actually born to be a game that anyone could play. It was invented by a gentleman who was a classmate of Naismith, who invented basketball. And he said, basketball is too hard. We need an easier game that anyone can play. And so volleyball became the game of equality. And ulama originated of a kind of a game as well that spoke to these relationships, but in a much more violent way. So I've always thought it interesting that in fact, along the US-Mexico border, these kinds of relationships and friendships and hardships have taken place and expressed through this game of what I call volleyball. And the question is, who won that first game of volleyball, since the border wall, in fact, leaned towards the Mexican side, which makes it more difficult to climb? Any guesses? It was Mexico. And the game continues to be played today. And in fact, somehow Tecate gets to place their stand on both sides. But I've mentioned how the wall is becoming a cultural object. And there's difficulty with that. There's the difficulty of normalizing the wall as a cultural condition. Because I'm in fact calling for the insertion of design in these landscapes to ameliorate the consequences of the wall. But in the meantime, the wall exists within our popular culture and in the political rhetoric, and it becomes very present. And so I'm going to show you two commercials that are really, really offensive right now, that speak to this idea of the wall as a cultural object. Can you hear this? So Tecate is still, walking in some, is the sound of a problem?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, maybe I'll just plug the headphones in. Let's see if that works any better. So I don't know what it means to, this is part of a longer research project about the wall and the wall entering the cultural imagination, sometimes for good, sometimes not so good, but also asking questions of where do we draw that line in our ethics in the understanding of the wall itself. Now this one's going to be bad. I hope you can hear it at least. Oh, you can't hear that at all.
No tax. Buy roasted peppers and onions? It smacks. Let's sell this.
Can they hear it? Can you guys hear that? Okay. They ask very profound questions in this commercial. They're asking questions about, is this landscape, is it Tex or Mex? Well, they were talking about the burger. But the power structure involved, this kind of heteronormative power structure that's in place along the, well, they recognize it's both, but they're going to sustain the revelation that in fact it's both, and bring that kind of unity together. But in the meantime, sitting back and watching the game play out.
Who won that one?
We all did. We all lost. I don't know. It's getting hot in here. I think this is one more story called Xylophobia. And again, more about the cultural imagination. In an episode of The Simpsons, the residents of Springfield construct this wall around their town because they don't want the neighboring town to take their jobs. And so Homer says, "I share your xylophobia, Lisa." Lisa says, "No, Dad, you mean xenophobia. Xylophobia would be the fear of xylophones." And she says, "I am afraid of xylophones," Homer says. "It's the music you hear when skeletons are dancing. You know how The Simpsons go." So would it make more sense to construct xylophones across the divide other than walls? Well, some people recognize that yes, that is important, like the artist Glenn Wand down in Tucson, Arizona, who uses sticks and found objects to bring people together across the border to dismantle the meaning of the wall, to convert it from a military structure into an instrument. To do binational performances. Sometimes he plays it like a bow and attaches very sensitive speakers to it. And in this case, you see he's using what he calls weapons of mass percussion. Speaking of the weapons of mass destruction that propagated the construction of the wall in 2006. And these are my memories of Glenn Wand. And sometimes Glenn even invites Border Patrol agents to play. Now, to bring this to a close, there are many people I discuss in the book and different ways to think about engaging the wall. The wall is the Borderwall's architecture book is really kind of a guidebook. I have one here. It looks kind of like this. But it's a guidebook to the wall, it's a biography of the wall, but I think it asks questions that come from others, really, like this artist, Ana Teresa Fernandez. She's based in San Francisco. But what she does is she finds swaths of paint that look like the sky, and she goes to Mexico, and she, often in high heels and a black dress, gets the blue paint and just begins to paint the wall. And people ask her questions like, "Excuse me, señora, what are you," in Spanish, "what are you doing here?" And she says, "Well, I'm painting this wall. It's so ugly. I'm trying to erase it." Her work is called Borrando la Frontera, erasing the border. And the effect is quite phenomenal, that the wall, in fact, begins to be erased and disappear. So I wonder if, in fact, things are coming full circle. The notion that design activism on the wall is actually beginning to be recognized by those who want to propagate the wall even further. If you saw the launch of Donald Trump's new walls, which cost between $300,000 and $500,000 a piece in their prototype form, they're near Otay Mesa, near Tijuana. These are on display and to be tested. But there's one particular wall that stands out to me, and it's the wall that's second to the upper top right there, the blue one. And when I saw this, because Donald Trump asked for big, beautiful walls, that there was an aesthetic consideration in the construction and design of this wall. Did the designers actually begin to co-opt Ana Teresa Fernandez's ideas about the wall and making the wall invisible when they thought this wall, when they designed this wall? And what does that mean? I like to reflect on this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, that every wall is a door. And in fact, I believe that the more that walls are constructed to divide nations, that in fact, that opens up more possibilities to thinking about how we might begin to dismantle them. Now I begin to see that some of the ideas from the book that were going on for some time are now beginning to be realized. The artist JR recently made this binational table along the border where he served a meal and brought people together. The Border Theater, the Borderwall Theater, a version of it was built in Douglas, Arizona, in Agua Prieta just a few months ago, that brought people together on both sides, with stages on both sides. And even after my friend Jill Holson, the photographer in Tijuana, Mexico, photographed Trump's wall and posted on Facebook, I couldn't help but grab that photograph in just a couple of minutes, made a sketch wondering if they're going to test it, did they do the 30-foot ladder test yet? And then just a few days later, Jill and some friends went out and they projected a ladder on the wall. So I'm optimistic that despite the perpetuation of walls along the border, that in fact every wall is a door to its dismantling. You can find more information about the book at borderwallsarchitecture.com, and I often post things about this in my travels on Instagram feed, RRAEL. Thank you guys very much, and we're going to go to part 2. Can we go to part 2? How are we doing on time? All the people who came to see the border wall are leaving. Bye. Now, I said this is born of the same mother. You guys in the back can come and sit down if you want. These are born of the same mother. And they're born here in New Mexico. And there's ideas that, this is going to be a total gear shift, and now I'm kind of having a schizophrenic moment. But there is an importance to additive manufacturing. I'm like freaking out here. I've never actually lectured these concurrently, but I thought it would be important in the School of Architecture. I mean, this is a graph that shows the relationship between 3D printing and materials and the innovations that took place. So I'm going to talk about my studio, Emerging Objects, and the contributions that have been made to 3D printing in our practice, and kind of weave a similar story about the border, but through 3D printing, and see if it makes sense. What we do at Emerging Objects is we invent materials for 3D printing that are affordable and strong, create assembly methods that do not require specialized skills, and we think about how to connect pre-industrial, industrial, and digital craft technologies. And what I mean by that is that my fascination with building materials like Adobe and the handmade are what drives the idea of how we might 3D print. This is me in my house. I have to mud plaster it every 10 years up in Colorado. That's a horrible photo. But I'm interested, I didn't know that photo was in there. But we ask questions about how architects might use these machines in the future and how they're using them today. Mostly we use them like this, right? We make small models to imagine what a building might be like, and we examine it for its scale and size and proportions and space. Or 3D printing looks like this at the architectural scale, where 3D printing kind of ugly concrete structures. So we're asking questions about how we might 3D print architecture in the 21st century related to craft and material origins. And rather than thinking of a very large 3D printer, we're thinking about how we can use small printers like a print farm and grow parts that are assembled together that are much more related to the hand and the body, and interested in the provenance of materials, where they come from, and what their trajectory is. Really rooting it in the idea of a brick, a 3D printed brick. I did not say. You will have to edit that later. I was still on the last, I was thinking about Donald Trump for a second. That is simple enough to use that anyone could put together, really. And how one might take a bioplastic brick and what its beauty might be, what its assembly might be. In this case, this wall that's made out of 3D printed components that are attached with 3D printed components that are quite easy to assemble. And how if we invest in that process, we might arrive at a kind of architecture that could be 3D printed, using the kinds of machines that are now very inexpensive and can fit on your table, and in this case, using 100 3D printers, print over 4,000 parts to assemble a structure whose assembly is entirely understood by the codification of its aesthetic. And what I mean by that is that the instructions to put this together are encoded in their color. And so you know that purple goes here and white goes here and transparent goes there. And so it's very easy to assemble. And that's what this particular project explores, that we call the Star Lounge. And the idea also is that even though we're making very small components, that we can aggregate those components together and assemble a large structure through larger prefabricated components that are delivered and assembled on site. This is one of the gratuitous stop-motion animations that every architecture presentation has to have. All right, the 2x4 isn't part of the design. All right. So, other experiments that were explored in plastic. Bye, Geraldine. Thank you for coming.
Again.
Our leader. She has a young niece that she has to go take care of. Thank you for coming. Who's next? So our research continues in plastic to a certain extent, and not only are we interested in the module and the design of the module, but now the behavior of the robot itself. And we're beginning to do experiments where we're controlling the G-code in such a way that it's much more like weaving than printing, that we're depositing material in ways that we can control the thickness and the aesthetic and the pattern, and we're hybridizing and bringing those together to create effects like this, or like this. And so again, it's bringing structure, thickness, material, pattern at very different scales. But plastic was not the only material that we wanted to print with. Of course, there's a big problem with plastic around the world, and 3D printing is being blamed for perpetuating those problems. So what other materials are available? And we have a 3D printer on our kitchen table, and we begin to look around our kitchen table and wonder what else is there that we could print with. All the coffee that my wife throws away at the end of the breakfast every morning, could we take that and 3D print it? And so we developed a material of 3D printed coffee using recycled coffee grounds, and we 3D printed these coffee cups to demonstrate the possibility. And then we 3D printed sugar to make the spoon, and we did it exactly in the volume of a tablespoon. So you would know how much sugar you were getting in your 3D printed coffee cup with your 3D printed spoon. And so there's a tablespoon and a half, a tablespoon, half a tablespoon out of sugar. But it actually makes no sense to make teaspoons out of sugar. So we went on to make 3D printed teaspoons out of tea. So these are the 3D printed teaspoons out of 3D printed tea that are exactly the volume of a teaspoon. And if you have teaspoons, then you need teacups. So these are the 3D printed teacups made out of tea. And if we have teaspoons and teacups, then we also need, here's the cups, so coffee cups and teacups. We also need a teapot. So what is the teapot? Well, if you're familiar with the history of computer graphics, one of the very first objects translated from the physical world into the computer and represented in a rendering on a screen was this at the University of Utah called the Utah Teapot. And that technology later went on to drive animation companies like Pixar, and if you watch any of the Toy Story movies or any Pixar movie, the Utah Teapot will appear somewhere in the movie. So we decided to bring the Utah Teapot back into the physical world with a 3D printed Utah Teapot made out of 3D printed tea. And this is the Utah tea set, minus the teaspoon, I guess. We have the sugar teaspoon in there. So what else is on the table? Salt. So we designed these really genius salt shakers that you depowder the salt shaker by shaking it. I don't know if you have one of these kind of printers where you have to dig it out the powder, but in this case you just shake out the salt out of the object to depowder, which is stupid, I know. But in our landscape, in the Bay Area, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of salt produced every year. And if you ever fly into the Bay Area, you'll see these amazing pink ponds. And these ponds are the crystallization ponds for the harvesting of salt. Essentially, they let in the seawater into these ponds. They let them sit there for a year. They evaporate, and what's left is about 5 or 6 inches of salt that are harvested. And so we've developed a 3D printable material that is 70% salt. And because it's so inexpensive, and a sustainable material that only needs wind and sun to produce, we have been able to think about how we might aggregate it together and build it up into parts to imagine walls. And we took on this project to think about how this landscape of salt, in the same way our landscape of clay in New Mexico makes adobe structures, how can the landscape of salt in the Bay Area make architecture of salt? And we are inspired by the Inuit igloo that takes also the context around it to produce the buildings. And so we embarked on a project called the Salt Igloo. And we named it that because it's made out of salt igloo. Man. Thinking about salt bricks. That joke was so bad. And the aggregation of lightweight salt bricks to produce a kind of salt tent held together with lightweight aluminum rods that keeps the structure in tension. There's about 340 of these salt bricks, all of which are different. This is really experiment in speed. How many bricks can we produce? How fast, how cheaply to assemble a structure that we can put together quite quickly? And we're imagining these for architecture. And this was funded by a commission for a house in China where we said, yeah, we'll print all the private parts out of salt in the house, but everything else will be made out of concrete. And so, but we did have an opportunity to think about other building components on the exterior, and it landed in an experimentation using a material that's also part of the landscape, sand in this case. A ubiquitous kind of material, and these were some of the studies for that building that were 3D printed out of sand, that were designed in a way that would modulate the light and modulate some of the views. And we've taken that to explore other kinds of possibilities using sand, giant kind of monolithic sound barriers and structural systems. And one project called the Quake Column, because these are like sandstone 3D printed blocks that are quite massive. We wondered if we can make the same kinds of, if we could imagine, I'll back up and say we're inspired by Incan ashlar masonry. And the way that that has become a responsive tectonic system to seismic loads, to lateral loads, that the building can actually shift and interlock back together, lasting for centuries. So this is our idea for a Quake Column, a very, very fast project, but designing kind of smart blocks that interlock together in such a way. Every block actually has a handle, instructions on where to put them. Every block weighs about 40 pounds, so it's quite heavy. But this is the Quake Column. The other material that's underfoot is clay, of course, and this is near and dear to my heart, but what does it mean to take man's oldest additive manufacturing material, 30,000 years old legacy that we have evidence of, and translate it into the 21st century using 3D printing? So we developed a way to 3D print clay, a very refined clay, and to test about tolerances and deformations in the kiln once we fire it to a ceramic. And what are the possibilities of that? Is it to make a 3D printed brick that can hold plants? Can we 3D print air pockets in ceramic that would be insulative? Can we combine traditional technologies? Because we're always looking back at tradition. Think about how, for example, in this ancient passive cooling system where large clay pots filled with water are placed in a window so that warm, dry air would be humidified and lower the temperature of a building's interior. This is found throughout the Middle East and Africa and in the Mediterranean areas. And it's really an early swamp cooler, a passive swamp cooler. So we designed these bricks that we call the cool brick. What 3D printing has allowed us to do is make a hyperporous material out of clay. And we could design into it then another level of porosity. So capillary action in each brick absorbs water like a sponge in this masonry unit. And then the other layer of porosity allows warm, dry air to blow through it and bringing humidified air into the interior. And these are these experimental bricks that we call the cool brick. And the relief that you see allows for the brick to remain in shade longer so that there isn't water lost to evaporation. And really, very in an unforgiving way, thinking about how we can use traditional masonry to stack to construct a wall in desert environments. taking some of the experiments from G-code plastic. Now we're beginning to explore G-code clay. And these, bye. I'm just gonna say bye to everyone. Because there's still like an hour and a half left. So we're taking these experiments about machine behavior and applying them to man's oldest material, clay, and we're coming up with experiments and objects that look like this, which I don't know what they're good for. But I think art is a lot like science because we do it because it's interesting, not because it necessarily has a use. And architecture's responsibility is then to synthesize what might be interesting and beautiful and useful and put them together in some kind of elegant way. So the objects that are emerging in these early experiments from a couple of years ago, in fact, are in my opinion, really, really profound. And while I don't know what they do, I don't know what their purpose is, sometimes they have appeared in galleries and in museums. And you'll find some of this work in the Albuquerque Museum, but also reverting them to architecture and thinking about ideas of micro-shading, for example, because of the texture, thinking about assembly methods and how those could allow for the creation of a new kind of masonry system on the exterior, or rain cladding system, or shade structure system. Other materials, paper, newspaper that we've ground up and converted into a 3D printed newspaper, which led to experiments in wood and using the 7 million tons of wood waste produced each year in the United States and transform what is essentially a subtractive process beginning with a forest and a tree and a saw and lumber and sawdust into products that are upcycled and give wood waste a new kind of value. But additive manufacturing adds a new layer to that. And not only do the layers of additive manufacturing give a kind of grain to the material itself, kind of returning to an unnatural wood state, but translucency, lightweight capacity, and in some cases are in tests stronger than wood itself. Always beginning with the brick, thinking about its modularity and its assembly into larger systems to create screens and walls, imagining building facades, interior and exterior applications. Our experiments in wood and having this ethos about the materials we derive coming from a particular radius around us in Berkeley, we began to look at Sonoma County and the excess of waste grape skins that are produced by the wineries. They don't know what to do with this. They've ground them up, they try to feed them to animals, they try to use it as fertilizer, they've put it in fancy bags and try to sell it to people. So we've taken that and we've developed a 3D printed material from it. And so, of course, we print these 3D printed Chardonnay wine goblets out of Chardonnay grape skins, as well as an ice bucket we made for Design Miami 2 years ago. And we contributed to the making of the table. The design is actually by the architect Andrew Cudlis from Matsis. 3D printed rubber. I don't know if you know what this is. This is the world's largest tire landfill site in Kuwait, where they recycled 0% of their tires. Here in the United States, we recycle about 80% of the tires, in fact, but maybe that's not enough. And can we take tires themselves and turn them into a 3D printable material and upcycle them? Well, we've been experimenting with that in our lab, working with a company that cryogenically freezes tires, pulverizes them into a dust. And so we've partnered with them, and now we're developing a 3D printable tire material. And these are some of the products of that research. And of course there's cement. Cement, you need a lot of water. What's going on in 3D printing and cement today is like stacking a wet material, which is a really hard problem to try to stack wet things. Our process uses very little water. It requires no formwork, which is about 60% of the cost of construction in the United States. Essentially you build a wood building and you pull it down after it's done. But this has no formwork. It can be very thin and translucent, very durable parts. We've compressed tested these stronger than concrete, although they're super lightweight, and this object is made out of paper clips, held together with paper clips. So very complex components can be put together and aggregated to make complex objects. like this bench that was inspired by a sea slug discovered off the coast of California. So we called our design the seat slug. This bench that took on the pattern that you saw on its back, which is really a traditional way of thinking about aggregation, arabesque or Japanese karakutsa tiles that can be randomly rotated and unleashed across the surface. This might be a process that many architecture students know very well, but modulated for volume and thickness and strength to create a 3D printed bench. Here you can see the parts being and the assemble that ultimately results in a kind of structural and discontinuously patterned aggregated surface of masonry components. And what's most exciting about all this, to me, is that this is the rendering, and we move very quickly from the rendering to the production. We skip many steps of drawing because the models are precise. And now we have a vehicle and a material to move from our designs in the computer to materials and forms in reality. So whereas architects were using 3D printers to just conceive of the buildings at the model scale, we can now use that same model to jump right into the building scale. And this is one of the largest things that we've printed called Bloom, made out of iron oxide free cement, which makes it a little bit lighter. But we're always thinking about the challenge of design. And if we can design, this one was, I don't remember, 600 unique parts. I don't quite remember how many parts it was, but to design each part is very difficult. But to just unleash a kind of texture map on it and say, open it in places and close down the facade in places, we can move through design and iterate through design much faster and create structures that have really phenomenal effects. The structure itself is extremely lightweight. And let's see if we advance to this next slide. It will in a second. But the structure is really a doubly curved surface, which gives an enormous amount of rigidity and strength. And it's just a torqued plus sign, and you can see it there. But it's about 6 inches thick at the base and just 1.5 inches at the top. And you can see the structure embedded on the interior. And there's our brutalist Worcester Hall at the University of California, Berkeley, and kind of the new 3D printed cement structure, which is broken down into 16 components because it was shipped to Thailand the very next day after we built it. And so it's part of this idea of using additive manufacturing as a prefabricated method. This is the second and last of the gratuitous stop motion animations that you will find in all architecture presentations. But it gives an example of how quickly these can be assembled. And one of my colleagues pointed out to me, Ron, you're still on that trajectory of really looking at the past and the buildings that you've studied in the past. I spent many years traveling in sub-Saharan Africa, and I didn't realize kind of this relationship myself, even though I'm always referring to it and speaking to it. But now we're beginning to bring all this research together. And when I say bring it together in many different ways. Many people ask us, well, you have so many materials, don't you ever make anything with different materials? And so we're beginning to think about different ways to bring them together. For example, this wall that's comprised of the waste of our own laboratory, in fact. 3D printed Chardonnay, 3D printed wood, 3D printed coffee, 3D printed cement of different kinds of cements. And sometimes those materials get mixed up and we just 3D print all that together. Thinking about gradients of materials, on the top 100% Chardonnay and at the bottom 100% Portland cement, and what that means to move from a geological to biological material. I don't know what it means, but maybe there's applications in the future for these kinds of gradients. At the very top is 100% curry, at the bottom 100% cement. I don't know why, but that's what it is. I don't know what it means. But I think in the pursuit of all this, we attempt to find meaning in the work. And if I make some reference now to, like, do you ever 3D print border walls, which is a call out and a question that always comes up, I'm going to say no, I don't 3D print border walls. And I've gotten calls from major 3D printer manufacturers, especially when there was a call for proposal for the wall. They would call me and say, can we partner together to 3D print the wall? But in fact, I was visiting El Paso and Juarez when Donald Trump said, there are some very bad hombres at the border. And I thought, well, that's interesting, bad hombres, because an ombre is a gradient from shade to light. An hombre is a man, but an ombre is a kind of gradient. And so these are called bad hombres. And it takes clay from the southern state of Georgia and clays from the western state of California and mix them together to talk about our differences and similarities through a ceramic object. And you can see how maybe there's gradients across the object, but you can also see distinctions at different scales in the objects themselves. And this particular series of bad hombres you can see at the Albuquerque Museum now. And we're always imagining this as architecture. So we're beginning to also design machines. And I've been working with this company 3D Potter for about 1.5 years now, because I proposed to him, I said, hey, I want to print Adobe. I want to in the field. And he said, okay, let's try to figure this out. So we developed this very low-tech robot that has really interesting applications, because now we realize that it can work like a robot, like a KUKA robot, and print lots of things. Or we're now beginning to think about how it can print really big things. And so the most recent version, which I wish I had video of because we just got the video yesterday, shows this connected to the robot, which is, this is a manual 3D printer. Testing clay deposition at large scale. So we're plugging all this together, thinking about how we might construct large-scale structures, walls, building components, buildings. So I'm hoping to begin to ask these kinds of questions. The question on the left is, like, well, it's not a question. I mean, it's really a really elegant solution to creating a pattern that allows a permanent scaffold to exist in the surface of a mud house to allow people to walk up the house and apply mud. And questions like that on the other side, which I don't know what their utility is yet, but I'm interested in finding out. Some places they have found utility is we're working with an organization that's establishing ecologies on the Farallones Island right off of the coast of California near San Francisco, where a particular species of bird is losing its habitat. And so scientists are putting artificial nests in this habitat to reintroduce areas where these birds can nest. And so they've made these plywood boxes and cooked the eggs, and they're trying different materials, but they see that ceramic works very well. And they came to me and they said, hey, can you make something ceramic that's 3D printed, that has ventilation, that has a kind of micro shading system, that can be printed in one piece. And so suddenly the experiments, the art experiments or science experiments that we're doing begin to have use. And just last month, we launched some of these 3D printed birds' nests that look like mailboxes, but that have these qualities on the Farallones Islands, and now they're being tested by scientists to see how well they work. And so we're going to move into phase 2 of this research soon. I'm working with scientists thinking about how we might use those same techniques to rebuild coral reefs in many parts of the world. And so coral actually attach very well to terracotta. And so we're going to produce, in the short term, 5,000 small terracotta objects into the ocean to test their ability to serve as seedling nests. But this, in fact, is a demonstration that we could print calcium carbonate as an educational component that you could dip in water and show how the acidification of the ocean, in fact, dismantles calcium carbonate. We're looking at furniture and other scales of materials, everything from jewelry to architecture. And it's been all coming together for us now in the construction of a micro house. The Bay Area has announced that they're suffering a housing emergency. If you've been following, housing prices in the San Francisco Bay Area are exorbitant. And there are many homeless people, and they have loosened their zoning restrictions so that now you can build up to 1,200 square feet in one's property without moving through the planning permission or an architect. And so we've taken that on as a challenge to think about how we can put these together in the construction of this house. One, in a house that has a ceramic cladding system that mediates the sun as a rain screen using this G-code clay process. This is an amazing photograph that we took at the summer solstice at noon, where each of the tiles just simply reached out and grabbed the sun. The exterior are all those materials that have been coated with a waterproofing, cement, coffee, wood, Chardonnay grape skins that hold air plants that will grow very well in the California climate. The interior is bioplastic, riffing off of pressed tin ceilings, but in a 21st century way, where every tile that clads this surface is not only different, but translucent, and we've backed it with a kind of LED polychromatic lighting system where we can change the mood and color of the interior of the house. And so we call this the 3D printed cabin, where we're bringing these technologies together and demonstrating that they do have application in architecture and that they do have the potential to transform the way we build in the 21st century. Thank you very much.